Okay, this lecture is about queer history. It's a broad overview of queer history. Mainly, I'm going to focus on the post-World War II period, but I am going to start by talking about some of the earlier history. So my main 2 points are, number one, the treatment of queer people, lesbians, gay people, bisexual, transgender, and other queer-identified people during the 20th century in the United States has not been simply one of gradual progress. It's more complex than that. So, the 1950s, for example, was very homophobic. Um, the 1960s and early 1970s marked a period of some progress, but the 1970s and 1980s, with the rise of the Christian right, the election of Ronald Reagan as president, and the AIDS epidemic, uh, queer people once again saw themselves becoming targets of hate and discrimination. So the second point that I want to make is that resistance to homophobia and transphobia was not invented suddenly in the 1960s, but it was in the 60s that we saw massive collective resistance by queer people who, for the first time, were coming out of the closets, demonstrating and demanding their rights as never before. So there are two ways to discuss U.S. queer history in the 19th and 20th centuries. So how society has defined queer people and how queer people have defined themselves. So let's look at the first way, how society has defined and discriminated against queer people. So from the mid-19th century through most of the 20th century, society viewed homosexuality through a triad of sin, illness, and crime. So in terms of sin, it's of course related to religion. In the U.S., various Christian denominations, with some exceptions, determined that being gay was not part of God's plan and thus was sinful. Of course, these days, we know that many Christians have challenged this idea, arguing for different interpretations of the Bible that are more generous and compassionate, and many people point to a loving God to argue against transphobia and homophobia. So secondly, crime and government. Cultural and religious norms have influenced the law historically. So federal, state, and local governments passed an array of laws that made both gay sex, which they called, laws outlawing gay sex were called sodomy laws. There were also laws that outlawed cross-dressing. So these laws didn't really begin to be overturned until the 1970s. Thus, in order to be themselves, queer people have faced police harassment and discrimination. So the third way that society has defined queer people is through medical science. Modern medical science, based on biomedical research, rather than older medical traditions like herbalism, first began to develop in the late 19th century. And it was in this context that the development of the medical model of sexuality in the Western world, including in the United States, develops for the first time. So this resulted in the creation of the modern categories of homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual. The term homosexual was actually first coined in 1863 by the Hungarian Carl Maria Kerpenyi, but it wasn't until 1892 that it was really introduced alongside the word heterosexuality to U.S. readers on a more widespread scale. Previously, of course, there were people who preferred same-sex intimacy or didn't identify with the gender assigned to them at birth. But for the first time, what's key here to understand is that medical science is creating these categories to define people's identities. Some in the medical field, referred to as sexologists, defended the rights of gay people. German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, as you know, rejected theories of mental illness and degeneracy to explain homosexuality and helped to found the German homosexual emancipation movement in the 1920s. We've talked about how his library was destroyed by the Nazis when they came to power in the 1930s. More prominent were the medical professionals, however, who described homosexuality as a sickness. And as this occurred, there was what was considered sinful or criminal type behavior was becoming a type of person. So people who committed homosexual acts continued to be arrested and jailed. But alongside the response came treatment and proposed cures. So the variety of treatments proposed would set the stage for the entire 20th century and ranged from things like abstinence, mandated, legally mandated, medically prescribed abstinence and cold baths, but also castration and psychoanalysis and various kinds of surgeries. A few sexologists and self-defined gay people continued to argue that same-sex attraction was normal and natural, but ultimately cultural norms that elevated heterosexuality won out for most of the 20th century. So it's hard to find homosexuality in the historical archives because it's something private and hidden because of the stigma attached to it by society. So historians have looked at arrests and convictions, cross-dressing laws, literature, correspondence, and diaries in an attempt to find queer people in history. One way historians have inserted queer people into history is by examining intense same-sex friendships, which have sometimes been referred to as either romantic or passionate friendships. So if they found evidence of these romantic friendships in diaries and correspondence, middle-class Americans in the 19th century lived according to strict gender roles and largely inhabited homosocial worlds. In other words, men socialized with men and women were expected to socialize with other women. So it's under this context, under these circumstances, that women's friendships became emotionally very close and sometimes even sexually intimate. Though it's much easier to find evidence of very emotionally close friendships between women and less easy to find evidence of sexually intimate relationships. So most women in romantic friendships ended up marrying men for a variety of reasons. Number one, sharing one's life with another woman rather than a man was stigmatized. And secondly, even if you wanted to do this, right, to be in a relationship with another woman, to do so, right, to do this despite the stigma, it was very financially difficult to do so because women were unable to find employment that would pay them enough to live on. Thus, women were likely to be too financially dependent on the men in their lives to pursue lifelong intimacies with other women. But a handful of women did. Some women, for instance, who were able to work as teachers could make enough money to separate themselves from men. Because gender norms in the 19th century said that close female friendships were normal, women in romantic friendships, as long as they weren't obviously sexual, and as long as these women ultimately married men, were not necessarily shunned by their communities in the same way that lesbians would be shunned in the late 20th century. So while these romantic friendships between women might be okay as long as they didn't go too far, cross-dressing was very much looked down upon in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Because cross-dressing was viewed as a threat to traditional gender norms, states and municipalities or cities began to pass anti-cross-dressing laws across the country in the 1860s and 1870s. So these anti-cross-dressing laws would not be repealed until the 1970s and even later. In mid to late 19th century, in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th centuries, there were three ways of being what today we would call transgender. So number one, some historians have looked at women who tried to pass as men for economic reasons. So you have single women who, without family support or being married, had a difficult time making a living. So there are examples of women, who dressing as men so that they could find jobs outside of the home because the wages that they received as women were far too low. So women might cut their hair short, wear male clothing, and adopt masculine mannerisms in an attempt to secure employment. So these women, of course, might not identify as men in all or most aspects of their lives. They're just doing it strategically for economic reasons. So the second class of people would be some women who wanted to break free of gender roles by traveling without male supervision, or they wanted to fight for their country. So they might also assume, uh, become wear men's clothing and assume masculine mannerisms in order to travel or to fight as a soldier. So the third reason is that, and of course the third class of people who were transgender, even though this term did not exist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we have people who were born, say, biologically female or male, but identified with a gender not assigned to them at birth. So they would be transgender. Right? In other words, at a deep level, they felt that their biological sex did not align with their gender identity, and so they might identify as transgender permanently rather than strategically or temporarily. So an example of an anti-cross-dressing law was one that was passed in San Francisco in 1863, and it specifically made it a crime for a person to appear in public, quote, in a dress not belonging to his or her sex, unquote. By the end of the 19th century, so around 1900, there were more than 100 people who were arrested for cross-dressing in San Francisco alone. So I want to give you a couple of examples of women who successfully either passed as men or dressed in masculine clothing. Deborah Sampson lived from 1760 to 1827. She fought against the British as a soldier in the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War. And during her 18 months as a soldier, she was wounded in battle. She contracted a fever, and after which she was discovered to be female and honorably discharged. So, if she was a woman, biologically female person dressing as a man to fight in World War II, she would not have been honorably discharged. But since we're talking about early American history, there were different policies. So she later married, though. She had 3 children, and she toured the Northeast speaking about her experience as a soldier. So she did not live, of course, permanently as a man. She identified as a woman and just dressed as a man for the purposes of fighting in the war. Another person is Dr. Mary Walker, who dressed in men's attire and worked as a surgeon during the Civil War in the 1860s. She differed from other passing women, though, because her intention was not to disguise herself as a man, but rather to wear male clothing as a woman. So she adopted what today we'd call butch lesbian identity. After the war, and until her death in 1919, she continued to wear men's clothing and wrote and lectured on various causes, including women's suffrage. Okay, now that we've established some foundations, I want to skip ahead to the 1950s. So, despite a political shift toward the left brought on by the Civil Rights Movement and other social movements in the 50s and 60s, legal forms of discrimination against queer communities were very widespread by the late 1960s, by the time that gay liberation comes into being. So, for instance, at the end of the 1960s, gay sex was illegal in every single state except for Illinois. There were, of course, laws against cross-dressing in cities across the country. The law did not protect queer-identified people from being fired or denied housing based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. There were no TV shows that had gay or transgender characters. There were no openly gay or transgender politicians. And when Hollywood made a film with a major gay character, that character was either killed or killed themselves for some reason. So, and of course, the psychological profession continued to treat both homosexuality and being transgender as a mental illness. So we've already talked about the influence of World War II and to some extent the influence on the Cold War, on lesbians in particular. As you know, there was relative acceptance during the war. Gays and lesbians in the military formed community with each other. but were also faced new forms of discrimination as they were purged from the military and they received these undesirable discharges. So this is all by the late 40s and into the 1950s. You have the Lavender Scare, in which the federal government fired queer federal employees en masse. And these purges of gay employees filtered down to local levels, as, for instance, lesbian school teachers were fired. Hundreds of lesbian school teachers were fired from schools in Florida in the 1950s and early 1960s. And on the screen here, you can see that there are two books if you want to read more about this. The book on the left, which is called The Lavender Scare by David K. Johnson, talks about the federal government's policy of firing people for being gay. And then you have on the right, And They Were Wonderful Teachers by Karen L. Graves, which is a really good book all about how gay, mostly lesbian school teachers were fired in Florida simply for being gay en masse. There's a couple of books about that topic. So essentially, the question is, why were they fired in the context of these, the Cold War, which we usually associate with anti-communism, and it's because queer people were identified as security risks in the context of the Cold War. So this idea that if exposed, if outed, they could be blackmailed by the Soviet Union to pass on government secrets. So before that could happen, we should fire them from the federal government. And if you're talking about, people at the local level, like teachers in Florida, this sort of the model at the federal level filtered down to what happened in the schools in Florida. But there's a different rationale used to fire gay teachers, and most prominently this idea that if you allow gay teachers to teach, then they're going to prove to be role models for children, and we can't have that, right? So you have to fire them, so that children don't think that it's okay to be gay. There's a documentary actually called The Lavender Scare, which you can watch. Okay, so despite discrimination and marginalization, queer people across the country did form communities of support, perhaps most notably in the gay bar scene, nightclubs, and for queer people of color, in particular at house parties from the 1940s to the 1960s. So these spaces were places where queer people could come together, meet each other, learn from one another, and be open about their sexual and gender identities. Though bar patrons still faced harassment, especially by police who regularly raided gay bars and beat and imprisoned the gay bar patrons, queer people were able, to some extent, to carve out a space relatively free of the day-to-day discrimination and harassment they faced in the straight world. So you have bars like Mona's in San Francisco, which is pictured on this slide. This was a bar that was located in North Beach in San Francisco and was popular from 1939 to 1948, and it was a bar that was particularly popular for lesbians. They had drag shows, but it was drag kings who performed, so women who dressed as men and performed on stage. There were also other bars like the Black Cat in San Francisco, opened from 1933 until the early 1960s. This mainly catered to gay men, drag queens, and trans women. And there were people like Jose Sarria, who not only performed in drag in the bar, he was famous for performing a drag rendition of the opera Carmen. But he was also a political activist, becoming the first openly gay candidate for public office when he ran for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1961 in response to a police crackdown on gay bars. So according to scholars of queer history, lesbian and gay bars in the 1950s and 1960s helped to spur the creation of lesbian and gay subcultures in particular, and a lot of the literature has been focused on lesbian and gay subcultures rather than trans subcultures. But without the bars, in other words, gay and lesbian subcultures couldn't have flourished, and the development of queer identities would not have solidified in the lead up to gay liberation. So I'm just going to repeat this point because it's so important, that you need the bars to create community, to create these subcultures. And because of the existence of these bars, people had a place to go. They had a place to learn how to be gay, how to be queer identified. So they solidified their own identities as queer also in the lead up to gay liberation. So I'm going to show this clip that is from a really good documentary called Outrage 69. It came out a while ago, but it's, I think, one of the best documentaries about Stonewall, the Stonewall riots, but also the first part talks about the queer bars, how important they are to this history. So I'm going to fast forward to...
Just going to the bar meant taking on 50s America. It meant being a woman who was different from the protected woman, the domesticated woman. It felt subversive, just going out in the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning, knowing that I was going to a place that was illegal.
Police would come in. Sometimes the raids would not, you almost wouldn't know what was happening. They'd just tell you have to stop dancing. They'd put on a white light. You'd see a policeman go in the back room, usually to get a payoff. I remember certain cities were very severe. They would put people's names and addresses where they lived and place of employment in the papers. So when someone got caught in a gay bar raid, they lost their job.
A gay bar is a social meeting place for homosexuals. The film you are now watching is purposely being projected in its negative form. The scenes were photographed with telescopic lenses from a hidden vantage point.
It's our duty to know what goes on around the jurisdictions that surrounding our particular area. And the situation is rapidly approaching the appalling stage, or the disgusting stage, to the point where Mr. Average Citizen is beginning to notice these things on the streets.
Came up and asked me to move, and then he proceeded to hit me with the billy club. I know he was jabbing me in my stomach, and I know he hit me across, my ribs. And all this time he was, calling me queer, cocksucker, bag.
I was mauled, literally felt up and mauled by these police. And that's how, they got their kicks off. They would just feel you up, and they would say things like, I remember this cop saying, oh, she's a woman. Oh, you think you're a man. This is a woman. She got tits or whatever. And so you felt little.
The mafia guys would run the place because in order to run a gay bar, you had to pay protection money because it was illegal to have a bar where gay people congregated. It was illegal for us to touch each other in public. In the one that I went to, the Sea Colony, there were two rooms. There was the outer room where you sort of sat around and drank and got hustled for watered down drinks and got to pay more than you would at any other bar in the city except a gay bar. In the inner room, they had a jukebox and you could dance with each other. It was like going through several stages of hiding from the rest of the world.
It made the community tight because of we had someone against us, So it was just a fearful, I can't explain it, explaining more than, it was fearful, but we knew what we were doing. And I think that's an important thing to say, that we knew the motions, we knew the dance, we knew how to survive, and that was important.
Okay, so one recurring theme in U.S. history is that alongside oppression comes resistance. And in the 1950s, queer people started to form organizations to advocate for their rights. For instance, the Mattachine Society was established in 1951 in Los Angeles by Harry Hay, who was a gay leftist activist. He felt that it was necessary for there to be an organization of gay people that could combat oppression by generating a group consciousness free of negative attitudes towards homosexuality. So the Mattachine Society, though it was open to both men and women, never really attracted a large number of lesbians. So that's key to understand about the Mattachine Society. Harry Hay argued that gay people constituted an oppressed minority, one that needed to come together politically to fight homophobia. The name of the group derived from groups of masked performers in medieval France who sometimes protested injustices and fostered group solidarity. So by 1953, the Mattachine Society had about 2,000 members. It had chapters in big cities across the country, but in order to protect the identities of its members from legal persecution, people only really knew other people in their chapter, their local chapter, or what they called a cell. The group sponsored discussions, lectures, and social gatherings, but it also organized politically. For instance, Mattachine members created a newspaper called One, which was, or I should say a magazine called One, which was published between 1953 to 1972, one of the most important and long-lasting early gay publications. So, in part inspired by the creation of the Mattachine Society, primarily white middle-class lesbians would gather in San Francisco to form a group of lesbians, for lesbians, called the Daughters of Bilitis. This would become the country's first national lesbian organization. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons, pictured here, were partners, and they decided to organize Daughters of Bilitis because they thought that a social outlet was needed aside from the bar scene. So they formed this group in 1955, initially mainly as a social club. And they took the name Daughters of Bilitis from Pierre Louis' Songs of Bilitis, which was a literary reference to lesbianism. But the group soon expanded from a social space to a political and educational organization and identified as both a feminist as well as an activist group for lesbian rights. The formation of a group specifically for lesbians reflected the conviction that the experiences and status of lesbians, though similar to those of gay men, also differed. While homophobia united gay men and lesbians in common oppression, and enforced gender roles stigmatized effeminate men as well as butch women, sexism uniquely affected women. So the group emphasized education and research and sought the help of professionals in law, medicine, and religion. Their politics were a product of the 1950s, however, and mixed conservatism and radicalism initially. So, though it was quite radical for the 1950s to argue that society should accept lesbians, which they were arguing, it was conservative to argue that in order for lesbians to be accepted by the larger society, they should dress in more traditionally feminine clothing. They tried to actively downplay the differences between gay and straight people. This, of course, is sort of like the politics of respectability. It has the effect of marginalizing people like trans people and butch lesbians whose gender identity and expression was a fundamental part of their identities, and thus a sense of, this is how they derived a sense of dignity as human beings in the world. So the Daughters of Bilitis launched a newspaper like the Mattachine Society did. Their newspaper was called The Ladder, and it lasted until the 1970s, the early 1970s. And chapters of the Daughters of Bilitis popped up in big cities around the country. The Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis were part of what's known as the homophile movement, the precursor to movements for queer liberation in the late 1960s and 1970s. So this early activism for gay rights is the precursor to gay liberation, lesbian feminism, and then trans liberation in the late 60s and 70s. So this is a photo actually of Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. Del Martin passed away not a couple of years ago, but they got married in June of 2008 after 55 years of being in a relationship with each other. So this is their first marriage ceremony. They actually got married twice because this marriage was deemed against the law. This is when then Mayor Gavin Newsom, decided that he would allow gay people to get married, but then that was ruled against the law. So then they got married a second time a few years later, when gay marriage was fully legal. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and this is just going to be part 1 of this lecture.